The Nexus station hung in space like a chrome bureaucrat's wet dream. All gleaming surfaces and pretentious architecture, designed to remind visiting species that someone, somewhere, had entirely too much time and money. Located precisely at the gravitational sweet spot between three major star systems, it served as the de facto capital of what polite society called civilized space, and what everyone else called that place where the Big Three tell everyone else what to do. Speaking of the Big Three, they had spent the better part of the morning congratulating themselves on their latest stroke of diplomatic genius. The Korathi Empire, whose idea of subtle negotiation involved parking dreadnoughts in your solar system, had provided the muscle. The Vex Collective, who treated organic life like a particularly stubborn software bug that needed patching, brought their technological superiority complex. And the Zelani Commonwealth, whose ambassadors could bore a black hole into submission with their endless procedural protocols, handled what they laughingly called diplomacy. Together they formed the Triumvirate Alliance, which sounded much more impressive than three species who got together because they were tired of everyone else having opinions. The subject of today's festivities was humanity, that peculiar little species that had somehow spread across 47 systems despite lacking any sensible approach to galactic politics. They didn't conquer with overwhelming force like proper militarists, didn't assimilate everything into a hive mind like respectable technologists, and certainly didn't follow the ancient traditions of diplomatic submission like civilized beings. Instead, they just existed. Stubbornly, inconveniently, with an alarming tendency to ask uncomfortable questions at inappropriate times. The Triumvirate had decided this simply wouldn't do. The terms are quite generous, Ambassador Velthani of the Zelani was explaining to the assembled council, his 7 eyes rotating in what passed for emphasis among his species. His voice carried that particular tone of condescension that only came from centuries of believing that talking very slowly made you sound intelligent. Complete economic integration under Triumvirate oversight, military disarmament with security provided by Korathi forces, and technological development guided by Vex protocols. All human colonies would retain their quaint local customs. Naturally, General Thakmor, whose Korathi battle armor made him look like a walking tank having an identity crisis, rumbled his agreement. Generous terms. Previous species required complete conquest. Humans should be grateful for peaceful assimilation. The Vex representative, a collection of crystalline structures that somehow managed to convey smugness despite lacking facial features, chimed in with harmonic frequencies that translated roughly to resistance is mathematically inefficient. Human acceptance of terms approaches statistical certainty. What they had delivered, in essence, was the galactic equivalent of surrender or will make you surrender but with more paperwork. The ultimatum had been transmitted to every human world simultaneously, complete with detailed projections of what happened to species who declined such generous offers. The deadline was sunset on Nexus Standard Time, because the Triumvirate believed in both dramatic timing and the power of arbitrary deadlines. The humans had 48 hours to respond. That was yesterday, which made it particularly interesting when the council chamber's main entrance opened not to admit a delegation with guards, advisors and enough ceremonial baggage to stock a museum, but instead revealed a single human female walking alone down the aisle as if she'd simply decided to drop by for tea. She wore no uniform, displayed no rank insignia, and carried nothing more threatening than a small leather portfolio that looked like it had seen better decades. Her hair was pulled back in what economists might call a practical ponytail, and her clothes suggested someone who had raided the wardrobe of a mid-level corporate manager from a species that actually understood the concept of comfort. The chamber, which moments before had been filled with the self-satisfied murmur of beings convinced they were about to witness a historic capitulation, fell silent with the kind of awkward pause usually reserved for wedding objections and surprise audit announcements. Ambassador Velthani's eyes performed what could only be described as a confused shuffle. Where is your delegation? Your security detail? Your anyone else? The human stopped at the speaker's podium, set down her portfolio with the careful precision of someone placing a bomb, and smiled. It was not, the assembled representatives noted with growing unease, the smile of someone who had come to surrender. "Oh, I think I'll be quite enough," she said, her voice carrying across the chamber with the kind of calm confidence that made experienced negotiators reach instinctively for panic buttons. After all, how many people does it really take to end a war? The question hung in the recycled air like an uninvited guest at a funeral, and somewhere in the back of every alien mind present, a small voice began whispering that perhaps they had made a rather significant miscalculation about the nature of human stubbornness. The human opened her portfolio with the casual air of someone reviewing a grocery list, completely ignoring the 3,000 years of diplomatic protocol that dictated she should begin with ritualistic greetings, acknowledgement of the council's authority, and at least a token gesture toward the traditional submission postures. Instead, she glanced at her notes and launched into what could only be described as the most unconventional negotiation opening in recorded galactic history. "Before we begin," she said, addressing General Thakmor directly, "how is your son doing at the military academy on Korathi Prime? The one who's been quietly questioning whether endless conquest is really the best path forward for your people." The general's massive frame went very still, which for a Korathi was roughly equivalent to a nuclear reactor achieving critical mass, while trying to look casual about it. The fact that humans even knew he had a son was concerning. The fact that they apparently knew what his son was thinking during private conversations was considerably more troubling. She turned to the Vex representative without waiting for an answer. "And the collective must be so proud of their recent efficiency improvement. Though I imagine the 17% increase in processing power becomes somewhat less impressive when you factor in the 43% rise in energy consumption. Basic mathematics suggests your current trajectory leads to grid failure within 18 months, but I'm sure the Vex have calculated all possible outcomes." The crystalline structures that comprised the Vex delegate began resonating at frequencies that roughly translated to uncomfortable humming, which was their species' equivalent of nervous laughter. Ambassador Vel Thani, who had spent centuries perfecting the art of diplomatic superiority, found himself in the unprecedented position of watching his carefully constructed morning fall apart before lunch. "How exactly do you possess this information?" "Oh, we get around," the human replied with the sort of cheerful vagueness that made intelligence officers break out in cold sweats. "But let's talk about your real problem. You've built this lovely alliance based on the assumption that everyone wants what you have: military strength, technological advancement, diplomatic stability. Very impressive resume. Unfortunately, you've made one rather fundamental miscalculation." She flipped a page in her portfolio, and somehow that simple gesture managed to convey more menace than an entire Korathi battle fleet. "You've assumed that humanity wants to join your club, that we look at your three-way power-sharing arrangement and think, oh my, that looks delightful, where do we sign up? But here's the thing about humans that your collective intelligence networks seem to have missed. We have this absolutely adorable habit of asking why when presented with seemingly obvious solutions." General Thakmor's translator was working overtime to process what sounded suspiciously like condescension wrapped in diplomatic packaging. "You question the benefits of alliance with superior civilizations." Superior. The human's eyebrows performed a small dance of polite skepticism. "Let's examine that claim, shall we? The Korathi Empire controls 47 systems through military occupation, spending roughly 60% of your GDP on maintaining forces necessary to suppress constant rebellion. That's not strength, General, that's an extremely expensive way to make everyone hate you." She shifted her attention to the Vex. "The collective has achieved perfect efficiency by eliminating every variable that makes life worth living. Your technological marvels are certainly impressive, right up until you realize that your society produces nothing new because innovation requires the kind of chaotic thinking you've systematically purged from your systems." The Zilani ambassador was beginning to develop what his species called a diplomatic headache, which resembled a migraine but came with additional existential dread. "And the Commonwealth?" "Ah yes, the Commonwealth. You've created a political system so Byzantine that it takes an average of 47 committees, 12 subcommittees, and one special investigative panel just to approve changes to cafeteria menus. Your diplomatic stability is actually bureaucratic paralysis wearing a fancy suit." The chamber had achieved the kind of silence typically reserved for funeral services and tax audit. Representatives from various minor species, who had come expecting to witness humanity's absorption into the triumvirate, were beginning to wonder if they should update their own defensive strategy. "Now," the human continued, consulting her notes as if she were discussing quarterly sales figures, "let's talk about economics. The triumvirate controls roughly 40% of known galactic trade routes. Impressive until you realize that human colonies account for 63% of the raw materials flowing through those routes, 47% of the manufactured goods, and approximately 81% of the food production that keeps your core worlds from experiencing what economists politely term famine-related social disruption. Ambassador Velthani's 7 eyes were now performing what could only be described as panicked mathematics. Surely you're not suggesting economic warfare? Warfare? The human looked genuinely puzzled. Oh no, Ambassador. I'm suggesting something much more civilized. I'm suggesting you consider what happens when humanity simply when our freighters develop mysterious engine troubles, when our agricultural worlds discover urgent environmental concerns requiring immediate harvest restrictions, when our manufacturing facilities need extensive safety inspection. She closed her portfolio with a soft snap that somehow managed to sound like the click of a loaded weapon. The beautiful thing about economic interdependence is that it works both ways. You need us considerably more than we need you. We've been quietly demonstrating our independence for the past 18 months, building alternative trade networks, developing self-sufficient colonies, and establishing diplomatic relationships with species you've been systematically ignoring. General Thakmor was experiencing the warrior's equivalent of watching his entire strategic doctrine crumble in real time. This is blackmail. Blackmail. The human smile returned, broader this time and somehow infinitely more unsettling. General, this is business. And if there's one thing humans excel at, it's understanding exactly what everyone else needs and figuring out how to provide it better, cheaper, and with considerably less condescension. The representatives of the triumvirate were beginning to realize that their carefully planned demonstration of overwhelming power had somehow transformed into something resembling a hostile corporate takeover, and they weren't entirely sure when the transition had occurred. The human reached into her portfolio once more, this time producing what appeared to be a standard data pad, the kind of unremarkable device that could be found in any office supply catalog across known space. She activated it with a casual tap, and suddenly the chamber's main display screens flickered to life with information that made the triumvirate's morning go from uncomfortable to catastrophic. Now, since we're all friends here, she began, her tone suggesting the exact opposite, let me share some fascinating discoveries our researchers have made about interspecies cooperation. The first screen displayed what looked like shipping manifests, but General Thakmor's enhanced vision caught details that made his primary heart skip several beats. Those weren't just any shipping records, they were classified Korathi military supply routes, complete with transport schedules, cargo specifications, and security protocols that were supposed to be known only to the highest levels of Imperial command. The Korathi Empire has been experiencing some interesting logistical challenges lately, the human observed with academic detachment. Apparently someone has been introducing microscopic flaws into the manufacturing process of your primary battle armor alloy. Nothing immediately dangerous, of course, just enough to reduce structural integrity by approximately 12% under sustained combat conditions. She swiped to the next screen, which showed a detailed schematic of Korathi armor plating with tiny red dots marking what appeared to be systematic weaknesses. The beauty of sabotage, General, is that it works best when the target doesn't realize it's happened. Your last 3 wargames resulted in an unusually high number of equipment failures, didn't they? The Vex representatives' crystalline structures began cycling through colors that roughly translated to escalating panic. Their harmonic frequencies shifted to what human ears might interpret as the sound of a computer having an existential crisis, which wasn't far from the truth. Of course, the collective faces different challenges. The human continued, apparently enjoying the symphony of alien distress. Being a hive mind has its advantages, but it also creates some fascinating vulnerabilities. For instance, what happens when someone introduces subtle errors into your shared information matrix? The display shifted to show Vex communication networks, but with peculiar gaps and inconsistencies, highlighted in uncomfortable detail. Those efficiency reports you've been so proud of, they've been missing some rather important data. The 17% processing increase I mentioned earlier, that's actually masking a 31% degradation in critical systems integration. You've been slowly losing the ability to coordinate between your outer colonies and core world. Ambassador Velthani's diplomatic training was warring with a growing sense of impending doom. His species had survived for millennia by being very, very good at reading the political currents of any given situation. Right now, those currents were spelling out a message that roughly translated to abandon ship immediately. And then we have the Commonwealth,
the human said, turning to address him directly. Your people's gift for bureaucratic complexity has created the most beautifully vulnerable administrative system in the galaxy. Do you know how easy it is to lose paperwork in a system with 47 levels of approval? The screen now displayed what appeared to be internal Commonwealth communications, including several that made the ambassador's 7 eyes widen in simultaneous horror. Personnel transfers that had mysteriously never been processed. Budget allocations that had somehow been redirected to accounts that didn't officially exist. Trade agreements that had been filed under classifications so obscure that even the people who created them had forgotten where to find them. The wonderful thing about bureaucracy, the human explained with the patience of a teacher addressing particularly slow students, is that it's designed to prevent anyone from having a complete picture of what's actually happening, which makes it remarkably simple to ensure that the people making decisions are working with incomplete, outdated, or entirely fictional information. General Thakmor's warrior instincts were screaming at him to do something violent and immediate, but his strategic training was pointing out that violence required functional equipment and reliable supply lines, both of which had apparently been compromised for longer than he cared to consider. How long? He growled. Oh, we've been planning this conversation for about 18 months, the human replied cheerfully. Though if you mean how long we've been collecting information, establishing contacts and placing our people in useful positions throughout your respective government, well, that's a considerably longer story. The display screens shifted again, this time showing what appeared to be ordinary citizens, workers and minor officials from all 3 triumvirate species, except the accompanying data suggested they weren't quite as ordinary as they appeared. Humans have this delightful tendency to be underestimated, she continued. We're not as physically imposing as Karathi, not as technologically integrated as the Vex, and certainly not as diplomatically sophisticated as the Zilani. What we are is curious, adaptable, and surprisingly good at making friends with people other species tend to ignore. The faces on the screen represented a network that spanned across triumvirate space like a web of casual acquaintances, who just happened to be in positions to observe, influence, or occasionally redirect the flow of information and resources. The maintenance technician who services your communication arrays, General. The data analyst who processes efficiency reports for the collective. The filing clerk who handles interdepartmental transfers in the Commonwealth bureaucracy. Amazing how invisible certain jobs become when you're focused on the big picture. Ambassador Velthani was experiencing what his people called diplomatic vertigo, the sensation of realizing that everything you thought you understood about a situation was not only wrong but had been deliberately orchestrated to be wrong. This is an act of war. The human looked genuinely surprised. Ambassador, this is just good intelligence gathering, though I suppose that depends on your definition of warfare. If knowing your enemy's weaknesses constitutes an act of war, then yes, we've been at war for quite some time. The difference is we've been fighting it with accountants, janitors and supply clerks instead of starships and plasma cannon. The chamber was beginning to develop the atmosphere of a disaster scene, with representatives from various species trying to calculate exactly how much of their own security had been similarly compromised while simultaneously updating their diplomatic positions in real time. Now, the human said, her voice taking on the tone of someone moving from exposition to business proposals, the question becomes, what do we do with all this information? We could certainly cause some rather spectacular embarrassment. System-wide equipment failures during your next military exercises, General. Cascading network crashes during peak efficiency periods, collective. Or perhaps some creatively misfiled documents that accidentally declassify your most sensitive diplomatic communications, Ambassador. She paused, letting the implications settle like radioactive dust. Or, she continued, her smile returning with interest, we could discuss alternative arrangements that benefit everyone involved. After all, the goal isn't destruction. It's simply ensuring that future negotiations begin with a more accurate understanding of everyone's actual position. The triumvirate was discovering that having your entire power structure exposed as a carefully maintained illusion was considerably less comfortable than they had anticipated. What happened next could best be described as the diplomatic equivalent of a three-way collision between starships, whose pilots had all been reading different navigation charts. The carefully maintained facade of triumvirate unity cracked like cheap hull plating under pressure, and the resulting implosion was spectacular to witness. General Thakmor was the first to break, his warrior's pragmatism cutting through the political niceties like a plasma blade through tissue paper. How long has the collective known about our equipment vulnerability? He demanded, turning on the Vex representative with the kind of directness that made diplomats break out in hives. The crystalline structures that comprised the Vex delegate began resonating with harmonics that roughly translated to nervous deflection with undertones of mutual accusation. Their response, when processed through the universal translator, came out as Karathi's security protocols were deemed sufficient. Vex analysis indicated external interference was statistically improbable. Statistically improbable. The general's translator was working overtime to convey what sounded like barely contained homicidal fury. Your analysis missed a sabotage operation that's been running for over a year. Ambassador Velthani, whose diplomatic instincts were screaming at him to restore order before everything collapsed entirely, made the mistake of trying to mediate. Perhaps if we focus on the immediate threat rather than assigning blame. Immediate threat. General Thakmor's attention swiveled toward the Zilani representative, like a weapons system acquiring a new target. The Commonwealth's bureaucratic incompetence allowed human agents to infiltrate our supply chains, and you want to discuss focusing. Bureaucratic incompetence. Velthani's 7 eyes performed what could only be described as an indignant shuffle. The Commonwealth's administrative systems are the foundation of interspecies cooperation. If the Empire had bothered to follow proper documentation procedures instead of relying on military arrogance, the Vex representative, apparently deciding that the conversation had descended below their intellectual standards, interjected with a series of harmonic frequencies that translated as, "Organic emotional responses are inefficient. Vex protocols prioritize logical solutions over blame allocation." Logical solutions. The general's laugh had all the warmth of a nuclear winter. Your logical systems have been compromised for months, and you didn't notice because you were too busy congratulating yourselves on your efficiency improvement. The human representative, who had been watching this exchange with the detached interest of a scientist observing a particularly fascinating chemical reaction, cleared her throat politely. The sound somehow managed to cut through the escalating argument like a sonic dampener, reminding everyone present that there was still someone in the room who held all the cards. "While this is absolutely fascinating," she said, her tone suggesting it was anything but, "perhaps we could return to the business at hand. After all, the deadline for your ultimatum is approaching, and I believe you were expecting some sort of response." The 3 representatives turned back toward her with the synchronized reluctance of students being called back to attention by a teacher they'd hoped had forgotten about them. "The response," she continued, consulting her datapad as if reading from a shopping list, "is the simplicity of it was somehow more jarring than if she had launched into a lengthy dissertation on human independence. 2 letters, 1 syllable. The complete rejection of 3 species combined military, technological, and diplomatic superiority, delivered with all the ceremony of declining an invitation to dinner." "However," she added, before anyone could process this sufficiently to mount an objection, "we do have some alternative proposals that might interest you." She tapped her datapad, and the chamber's display screens shifted to show what appeared to be trade agreements, but with terms that looked nothing like the traditional submission documents the triumvirate was accustomed to dictate. "The Karathi Empire needs reliable supply lines that aren't vulnerable to the kind of sabotage we've just demonstrated. We can provide those, along with technical consultants to help identify and repair the existing vulnerabilities in your equipment. In exchange, you'll recognize human territorial sovereignty, and agree to purchase military supplies through legitimate commercial channels rather than conquest." General Thakmor's expression suggested he was watching his entire worldview being systematically dismantled and replaced with something that looked suspiciously like a business transaction. "The Vex Collective requires diverse information sources to maintain system integrity. We can offer access to human research networks and cultural databases that will enhance your analytical capabilities, without compromising your core protocols. In return, you'll provide technological consulting services under standard commercial contracts, rather than assimilation demand." The Vex representatives' harmonic frequencies had shifted to what might charitably be called confused acceptance, and the Zilani Commonwealth needs administrative efficiency improvements that don't require completely restructuring your governmental system. "We can provide consultation on streamlined procedures and cross-cultural communication protocols. In exchange, you'll serve as neutral mediators for interspecies disputes rather than attempting to absorb smaller civilizations into your bureaucracy." Ambassador Velthani was discovering that being offered exactly what his people needed while simultaneously being denied what they wanted was a diplomatic experience for which his training had not prepared him. These terms, he began carefully, would essentially formalize the current balance of power rather than establishing triumvirate hegemony. Exactly, the human agreed with cheerful finality, except instead of pretending that balance doesn't exist, we'll acknowledge it openly, and work within it. Everyone gets what they actually need, nobody gets to play galactic overlord, and commerce continues flowing without the overhead costs of maintaining occupation forces, assimilation protocols, or administrative empires. The three representatives looked at each other, then at the proposed agreements, then at the human who had somehow managed to transform their carefully planned demonstration of overwhelming power into what appeared to be a mutually beneficial business arrangement. General Thakmore was the first to speak, his voice carrying the weary tone of a warrior who had just realized that the most decisive victory involved never fighting at all. These terms would be acceptable to the The Vex representatives, harmonic response translated roughly as, logical efficiency parameters, are satisfied, collective consensus achieved. Ambassador Velthani's 7 eyes performed one final diplomatic calculation before he nodded slowly. The Commonwealth finds these proposals workable, and so as the afternoon sun set over Nexus Station's gleaming spires, 3 separate styluses signed 3 separate documents, officially ending a war that had never quite begun. The assembled representatives filed out of the chamber with the subdued air of beings who had arrived expecting to witness a surrender, and instead found themselves processing the most anticlimactic peace treaty in galactic history. The human representative gathered her papers, closed her portfolio, and walked back down the aisle with the same casual confidence she had displayed upon arrival. She paused at the chamber entrance, glanced back at the now empty podium where the fate of 47 human worlds had just been decided through a combination of spreadsheets, supply chain analysis, and strategic embarrassment, and smiled. After all, she reflected, there was something delightfully human about ending a war not with a bang, but with a signature on a contract that everyone pretended they had wanted to sign all along. By sunset, the war was indeed over. It had just ended rather differently than anyone had expected when the morning began.